New kid gets bullied, but he's an unstoppable fighter and turns the tables on them. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. In the small, sleepy town of Brookside, nothing ever seemed to change. Life flowed predictably, with the same faces, the same routines, and the same gossip that spread through the streets like clockwork. But when Ethan Parker, a new student, arrived at Brookside High, he quickly became the center of attention. With his tall frame, dark clothes, and an air of quiet indifference, Ethan didn't try to stand out. He sat at the back of the classroom, spoke only when necessary, and avoided drawing attention to himself. But despite his best efforts to blend in, the students couldn't help but whisper about him. To them, he was just another newcomer, another mystery to solve. Little did they know, this boy was about to shatter the school's fragile peace and teach the bullies of Brookside High the harshest lesson of their lives. The whispers about Ethan didn't take long to reach the ears of Troy and his crew. The self-appointed rulers of Brookside High. Troy, an arrogant jock with an ego as inflated as his athletic abilities, couldn't stand the idea of a quiet, unassuming kid slipping into their territory unnoticed. So, one afternoon, as Ethan sat alone in the cafeteria, minding his own business, Troy and his friends decided to make him their target. They approached with smug grins, their laughter cutting through the hum of the lunchroom. "Hey, new kid," Troy sneered, slamming his hand down on the table. "Planning to join a team? Or are you just here to waste space like the rest of them?" Ethan looked up slowly, his gaze cool and steady as he sized up the group. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak, he simply went back to eating, unfazed by their taunts. The bullies exchanged amused glances, looking for any reaction, but got nothing. One of them scoffed. "He's mute, huh? Or maybe just too scared to talk." The laughter spread, but Ethan didn't flinch. With calm precision, he picked up his tray, stood up, and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving the group of bullies behind in stunned silence. To them, this was a game. They had expected a fight, a reaction, but Ethan had shown them something far more powerful. The ability to ignore their childish provocations. They wanted a reaction, but they hadn't gotten it. And they didn't know it yet. But they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. As days passed, the bullying escalated, and Troy's group became more persistent. They started small, bumping into Ethan in the hallways, knocking his books to the floor, and making cruel remarks as they passed. But Ethan never reacted. The more they tried to provoke him, the more they realized they were getting nowhere. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he refused to play their game. And that only made them more determined to break him. One afternoon, as Ethan walked out of school, he was stopped again. Troy and his gang stood blocking his path, grinning as if they had caught him at his weakest moment. "You think you can ignore us forever?" Troy taunted, his arms crossed over his chest. "What are you hiding, huh? You've been quiet for too long. What's your deal?" Ethan said nothing, his gaze never wavered. His eyes calm yet unyielding. He was no fool. He knew the game they were playing, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. But Troy wasn't done. He wanted to see Ethan crack, and he would do anything to get that reaction. One of Troy's friends, a bulky guy named Mason, shoved Ethan, not hard enough to knock him down but just enough to test his patience. The push wasn't unexpected, but what happened next was, with a speed that no one could have anticipated, Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing Mason's wrist and twisting it in a fluid motion. In the blink of an eye, he spun Mason around, using his own momentum to slam him onto the pavement. The sound of Mason crashing to the ground echoed in the empty parking lot. And for the first time, Troy's smirk faltered. Ethan stood there, unmoving, his expression as calm as ever. His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words hit hard. "I'm done playing your game," he said. Troy's face twisted in confusion, his bravado slipping. He had expected fear, resistance, anything, but what he got instead was a stark reminder that Ethan was no ordinary target. He wasn't just some kid to be pushed around. And as he watched Ethan turn and walk away, leaving Mason struggling to get back on his feet, something inside Troy snapped. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, the atmosphere at school was thick with whispers and gossip. News of Ethan's confrontation with Mason spread like wildfire. And by the time the final bell rang, every student seemed to know exactly what had happened. Troy and his gang didn't show up to school, and Mason, usually the loudest of the group, walked with his head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The once feared bullies were nowhere to be found, and the hallways, for the first time in years, felt different, lighter, quieter, and free from the tension that had plagued them for so long. Ethan, however, didn't bask in his newfound status. He wasn't interested in becoming a hero or a symbol of strength. He walked through the halls like he always did, quiet, unassuming, focused only on what mattered to him. His expression was unchanged, and the weight of the attention he now commanded barely registered on him. He had done what he had to do, and now, he just wanted peace. But peace wasn't something he was destined to have for long. During lunch, as Ethan sat in the library, lost in his thoughts, a familiar face approached. Mr. Reynolds, the history teacher, pulled up a chair and sat across from him. Ethan raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. "I heard about what happened with Troy and his friends," Reynolds said, his voice low but full of understanding. "You handled yourself well. Most kids would have crumbled under the pressure." Ethan shrugged, unwilling to say too much. He didn't want to draw attention. "Not to this. I'm just doing what I need to do," he replied quietly. Reynolds leaned in slightly, studying Ethan's demeanor with a sharp eye. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Ethan paused, his calm facade slipping for a brief moment. "My father," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "He trained me. He's a professional fighter." Reynolds' eyes widened, and the pieces began to fall into place. The controlled movements, the lack of fear, the precision in Ethan's every action, it all made sense now. This wasn't some random kid who got lucky. Ethan had been trained, and not just by anyone, but by someone who knew the fight game inside and out. "I see," Reynolds said slowly. "Your father was a legend in the ring, wasn't he?" Ethan's gaze hardened, and he nodded. "He was. He taught me everything I know." Reynolds sat back, folding his arms thoughtfully. "You know, Troy and his crew aren't going to let this slide. They're going to come after you again. But you have something they don't: discipline. Control. Don't let them bait you into something you'll regret." Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but his voice was firm. "I know, and I'm ready." What neither of them knew was that Troy, overhearing their conversation outside the library door, had heard everything, and now, he understood. Ethan wasn't just some kid to push around. He had the skills, the discipline, and the will to fight back. He was someone to be reckoned with. The game had just changed, and Troy wasn't about to lose. The next afternoon, the tension was palpable as the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. The students quickly shuffled out of classrooms, eager to witness the showdown that everyone had been whispering about all day. Behind the gym, a large crowd had gathered, buzzing with anticipation. This was no longer just another case of bullying. It was now a spectacle, an event that would either solidify Troy and his gang's dominance or, just maybe, bring their reign to an end. Ethan walked to the back of the school with a calm demeanor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers following him like a shadow. He didn't care. He had come for one reason: to put an end to this once and for all. As he rounded the corner behind the gym, he saw Troy and his group standing there, waiting. They looked different, serious, even anxious, no longer smirking, no longer taunting. There were no more words exchanged, just an unspoken challenge in the air. Troy stepped forward, his usual arrogance replaced with something sharper, something darker. 5 against 1, he sneered, the words dripping with malice. "You really think you can take us all on?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the group, waiting. Troy and his friends exchanged looks, and in the next instant, Mason lunged at Ethan, his large frame coming at him like a freight train. But Ethan was faster, much faster. He sidestepped, grabbing Mason's wrist in one smooth motion, twisting it and flipping him to the ground. The crowd gasped, and for a split second, there was stunned silence. 2 more of Troy's goons charged at him, fists swinging wildly, but Ethan was already moving. He ducked under one punch, pivoted, and slammed his elbow into the other's ribs. The sound of impact was loud, and the guy staggered back, winded. The crowd roared in disbelief. But Ethan didn't pause. He didn't care for the spectacle. He was here to end this, not to show off. Now, only 2 of Troy's friends remained. They rushed at him together. But Ethan was ready. He ducked low, catching one of them by the wrist, twisting it, and using his momentum to send him crashing into the other. Both men crumpled to the ground. And in mere seconds, it was over. The crowd erupted into cheers. The tension, the fear that had hung in the air for so long, was gone. Ethan stood there, breathing calmly, looking down at the defeated bullies. Troy was the last one standing, his fists clenched, his body rigid with anger. He stared at Ethan, eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You think you're better than us?" Troy sneered, his voice thick with frustration. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his fists. Instead, he walked toward Troy, each step deliberate, measured. The crowd held its breath. "No," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I just think you're not worth my time." Without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Troy standing there, humiliated and powerless. As he made his way back through the crowd, the murmurs and whispers followed. But this time, they were filled with awe, not mockery. Ethan had done what no one had dared to do. He had taken down the bullies, made them face the consequences of their actions, and shown the school that fear was no longer the ruling force. The reign of Troy and his gang was over. For the first time, the students of Brookside High could breathe easy. And Ethan? He had proven, once and for all, that some people aren't meant to be messed with. The following morning, the atmosphere at Brookside High was noticeably different. The usual hum of chatter and the murmur of lockers being slammed shut were replaced by an unusual sense of calm. The once dreaded presence of Troy and his gang was gone. No shoves in the hallway. No cruel words thrown at unsuspecting students. No laughter at the expense of others. For the first time in years, the school felt like a place where students could walk freely, without fear of the bullies. But while the halls had fallen silent, Jake knew better than to believe it was truly over. The weight of yesterday's victory still hung in the air, and he was aware of the fact that Troy wasn't the type to back down easily. He had humiliated them in front of the whole school, and that kind of defeat would leave a mark. As Jake walked to class, he kept his guard up, his senses sharp. Sure enough, as he turned the corner, he saw Troy and Mason standing in front of him, but there was something different in their posture. Gone were the smirks, the cocky attitude. Now there was an awkward silence. "I guess we owe you an apology," Troy said, his voice quieter than usual. It was hard to recognize the arrogant leader of the pack in the hesitant young man standing before Jake. Mason shifted uneasily, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah, we were out of line. You proved your point. We're sorry." Jake stood still, analyzing them carefully. This was not the response he had expected. There was no defiance, no anger, just an uncomfortable acceptance of the truth. It was almost too easy. For a moment, Jake didn't know how to react. He had been preparing for the next fight, the next round of humiliation. But now, standing in front of him, were two of the bullies he had taken down the day before. Admitting they were wrong. "You know," Jake said, his voice calm, measured. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Troy gave a small, forced chuckle. "Yeah, well, I guess even I can learn a lesson." He shook his head and started to walk away, Mason following closely behind him. Jake watched them leave, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. The weight of what had just happened. Troy, the school's untouchable bully, admitting defeat, was surreal. He hadn't expected this kind of resolution. It felt almost anticlimactic, but in the end, it was the resolution he had wanted all along. He had stood up for himself, proven his worth, and changed the dynamic at Brookside High. But more than that, he had come to understand something crucial. Sometimes, the best victory is simply walking away, leaving the past behind. As the two bullies disappeared around the corner, Jake took a deep breath. Brookside High had changed, and so had he. He had earned the respect of his peers without a single word of boasting or a punch thrown after the fight. And now, for the first time since he had stepped into this town, he could finally focus on what really mattered, living his life in peace. At least, for now. Days passed, and the atmosphere at Brookside High was lighter than it had been in years. The once oppressive weight of Troy and his gang's bullying had vanished. No longer did students hide their faces in the hallways or fear the scorn of the powerful clique. They walked freely now, laughing, joking, unburdened by the constant tension that had once permeated the school. It felt like a fresh start, as if the school had been reborn. Yet Jake knew better than to believe that this peace would last forever. Troy wasn't the type to back down so easily. And though the halls were quieter, Jake still felt the lingering tension of unfinished business. One afternoon, as Jake walked home from school, he heard the sound of footsteps following behind him. Not one set of footsteps, but several. Closing the distance, Jake turned around slowly, knowing exactly who it was before he even laid eyes on them. Troy, Mason, and a couple of others stood behind him. Not smirking, not taunting, just standing there. Looking different. Their usual arrogance was replaced by a sort of reluctant humility. And for a moment, Jake almost didn't know what to make of it. I guess we owe you an apology," Troy said, his voice quieter than ever before, stripped of its usual cocky bravado. His eyes flickered briefly to the ground, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to look Jake in the eye. "You were right. We were out of line. All of us." Mason nodded slowly, his usual tough demeanor now deflated. "Yeah, we were idiots. You proved your point. Man, we get it now." Jake studied them, his gaze cool but not unkind. He had known it would take more than one fight to break through the thick skulls of these bullies. But this was unexpected. It wasn't what he had imagined when he first walked into Brookside High. When he had come to terms with the fact that he would have to fight for respect. It wasn't what he had expected after taking down Troy's gang. But here they were, apologizing, acknowledging their mistake. It didn't change the past, but it was a step forward. Troy sighed, looking up at Jake with something close to admiration, though it was still mixed with a hint of shame. "Look, I'm not saying we're going to be friends or anything," he said, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But you proved your point. We were wrong, and you were right." Jake gave a small nod, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "Took you long enough to figure that out," he said with a dry chuckle. Troy let out a half-laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson." And with that, he turned around and started walking away, Mason following behind him, both of them silently acknowledging the shift in power. Jake watched them go, his heart light but his mind alert. The school had changed. Troy and his crew had been humbled. And for the first time in years, the oppressive atmosphere that had suffocated the students of Brookside High was lifted. Jake had done more than stand up for himself. He had made a statement to the entire school. But more importantly, he had shown them all that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you can do, but from knowing when not to fight. As the two bullies disappeared into the distance, Jake felt the weight of the past few weeks lift off his shoulders. And for the first time in a long time, he was at peace. The next morning, the entire school was buzzing with whispers. Rumors spread like wildfire after the fight behind the gym. Students who once avoided eye contact with Jake now watched him with a mix of awe and respect. The once dreaded bullies, Troy and his gang, were nowhere to be seen, and the atmosphere at Brookside High was light for the first time in years. The laughter and chatter in the hallways seemed to have returned, but with an edge of nervousness, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jake, however, remained as calm and composed as ever. He didn't walk through the halls like a hero or a conqueror. He walked like a man who had fought, won, and moved on. No bragging, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the bullies had been put in their place. But Jake knew this peace wouldn't last forever. Bullies didn't just accept defeat. They plotted comebacks, learned from their mistakes, and waited for their next opportunity to strike. That's why when the final bell rang and Jake made his way outside, he didn't let his guard down. Sure enough, as he stepped out of the building, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind him. It was Troy, Mason, and a couple of others. But they weren't laughing, taunting, or trying to intimidate him this time. They looked different, smaller, almost humble. I guess we owe you an apology," Troy said, his voice quieter than usual. Jake raised an eyebrow. This was new. He hadn't expected this. Mason shifted awkwardly, his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, we were out of line. We get it now. You proved your point." Jake didn't react immediately. He just stood there, looking at them. The tension was thick in the air. But there was something different about it, something that felt genuine. This wasn't the typical defeat of someone being forced to apologize to avoid further punishment. This was a shift, an acknowledgement of power. "Well, took you long enough," Jake said coolly, his voice calm. It wasn't a mockery, just the simple truth. He had expected the apology, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. Troy gave a small, reluctant smile, scratching the back of his head. Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson. The words were awkward, not easy to say, but they held weight. With that, the group turned, and Jake watched them walk away, knowing that they had finally understood the lesson he had been trying to teach. Brookside High had changed, perhaps not forever, but at least for the moment. And Jake? He had made his mark. He didn't need their respect to prove his worth. But now, for the first time, it felt good to be seen. Not as the quiet, unremarkable new kid, but as someone who had earned the right to stand tall. The school had changed, and so had he. The next day, the entire school was alive with whispers and stolen glances. The fight behind the gym had become the topic of every conversation. The news spread like wildfire. And suddenly, Jake was no longer just the quiet new kid. He was the one who had taken down Troy and his entire crew without breaking a sweat. The tension that had once suffocated Brookside High seemed to evaporate overnight. Students who had once avoided eye contact with Jake now greeted him with a nod or a smile. Their fear replaced with admiration. But Jake remained as calm as ever, walking through the halls as if nothing had changed. He didn't let the new attention get to him. He had never wanted to be the hero. Never wanted to prove anything to anyone. He had simply wanted peace. And for the first time in months, it seemed like he had found it. Yet, Jake knew better than to believe that the battle was truly over. Bullies didn't just slink away after a defeat, they simmered, plotted, and waited for the right moment to strike back. The thought lingered in Jake's mind as he made his way out of the school building that afternoon. His footsteps were calm, deliberate, as he took the familiar route home. And then, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. This time, it wasn't just one set of steps, but several, closing the distance. Jake didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Troy, Mason, and the others. But something was different. The usual smirk on Troy's face was gone. Instead, there was a look of reluctant acknowledgement. Something almost human. As they reached him, Troy spoke first, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the arrogance it once carried. I guess we owe you an apology, Troy said, the words awkward, stumbling out of his mouth. Jake raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what he had expected. Mason, standing beside him, nodded sheepishly. Yeah, we were idiots, he added. You proved your point. Jake studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable. But there was no hint of the hostility that had once marked their encounters. Took you long enough to figure that out, Jake said, his voice dry, but not mocking. Troy let out a short, forced laugh. Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson. Jake said nothing, his gaze steady. He could feel the shift in the power dynamics, the change in the air. It wasn't a victory that came with triumph or celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. The bullies were no longer in control. And they knew it. They didn't need to apologize. But they did. And for that, Jake gave them a small nod, his way of acknowledging their change. With that, Troy turned and started walking away, Mason following close behind. Jake stood there for a moment, watching them go, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this battle was over hanging in the air. Brookside High had changed, not just because of what happened behind the gym, but because of the lesson learned, the lesson that strength, in its truest form, wasn't about domination. It was about knowing when to stand up and when to walk away. As Jake turned and walked back toward home, a strange sense of peace settled over him. The weight of the past few weeks had lifted, and for the first time in a long time, he could breathe easily. The fear, the tension, the bullying, it was all gone. And though the future was uncertain, Jake knew one thing for sure. He had changed not just the school, but himself. And that was enough.